I don't know why I'm doing this. My granddaughter set up this camera 3 weeks ago. She said, "Grandpa, just talk, say whatever you want." And then she left for college, and the camera just sat there on the dresser, watching me. I'm 90 years old. My name is Walter Ashby, and I've been sitting across from this camera for 3 weeks trying to figure out what I actually want to say. I think I finally know. There's a phone call I got in the winter of 1987. I was 51 years old. I was in the kitchen. The linoleum floor had a crack near the refrigerator that I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. I remember staring at that crack while the phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. It was my brother, Daniel. He didn't say hello, he just said, "Pop's in the hospital." And then there was a pause. One of those pauses that has weight to it, like the air thickens. And I said, "Okay, how bad?" And he said, "Bad enough that you should come." I said I would come the next morning. I didn't go that night because I had a work presentation. I actually had a work presentation. I stood in that kitchen with the cracked linoleum floor and I made a calculation. I told myself my father was strong. I told myself the next morning was basically the same thing as tonight. I told myself a lot of things that took about 4 seconds to think and about 39 years to stop thinking about. My father died at 3 a.m. I was asleep in my own bed 40 minutes away when it happened. Daniel called again that morning. Same phone, same kitchen. I was already dressed for work. He didn't say much. He told me the time it happened. He told me it was quiet, that the nurses said it was peaceful. And then there was another pause. This one was different from the first one. The first pause had been heavy. This one was hollow, like something had been removed from it. I said, "I'm sorry, Daniel." He said, "Yeah." That was the last real conversation we had for almost 6 years. I didn't understand that at the time. I thought we were both just grieving. I thought the distance between us was temporary, the kind that comes after loss and closes on its own. I kept thinking it would close, the way you think a wound will close if you just leave it alone long enough. But some wounds don't close when you leave them alone. Some of them just quietly become permanent. I want to tell you something about silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind you choose when you sit by a window in the morning with your coffee and the world hasn't started yet. I mean the other kind. The kind that moves in after something goes wrong and you don't fix it. The kind that has a texture to it, cold, slightly damp, like a basement that hasn't had a window opened in years. That silence moved into the space between me and my brother in the winter of 1987, and it never fully left. We spoke over the years, Christmas calls, birthday calls, calls when his kids graduated, when my kids got married, calls that were perfectly civil and perfectly empty, calls where we said everything except the one thing that was sitting right there in the middle of every conversation, taking up all the room. I never said, "I should have been there." He never said, "Why weren't you?" And somehow that unspoken thing became the whole relationship. I've been trying to remember the last time Daniel and I laughed together, really laughed, the kind where you can't catch your breath and your eyes water, and you forget for a moment what you were even laughing about. I think it was 1974. We were in our parents' backyard. He was throwing a football badly, and I was making fun of him, and our mother came out to yell at us for something, and we both just collapsed into the grass, laughing like children, which I suppose we still were in some ways. He was 31. I was 38. That was the last time. I don't know when it became the last time. You never know when something is the last time. That's the part nobody tells you. You go through moments thinking there will be more moments. You let something end assuming it hasn't ended. You put things off into a future that you're absolutely certain exists. And then one day you're 90 years old sitting in front of a camera your granddaughter set up, and you understand that the future you were so certain about was never guaranteed. It never was. You just believed it was because believing otherwise would have required you to act, and acting was harder than waiting. Waiting is always easier, right up until it isn't. Daniel died in 2019. Pancreatic cancer. He went fast, 3 months from diagnosis to the end. I flew to Portland in October. I sat beside his bed in a house that smelled like pine and something medicinal, and I held his hand. He was sleeping most of the time by then. He woke up once while I was there. He looked at me. He said my name, Walt. And I said, "I'm here, Danny." He nodded, like that was enough. Like me being there, finally, after everything, was enough. Maybe it was. I don't know. I hope it was. But I've thought about that moment almost every day since then. The way he said my name, quiet, without accusation, without the 32 years of silence loaded into it, even though they were there. They had to have been there. You don't just set down 32 years of silence. It doesn't evaporate because someone is dying. But he said my name like none of it mattered anymore. And I have never decided whether that was forgiveness or exhaustion or just what happens when the body gets small enough that it can only hold the simplest things.
After Daniel died, I went back to our childhood home. It had been sold decades before. A young family lived there. I didn't knock. I just stood on the sidewalk and looked at the front porch. Someone had painted it blue. It used to be white. My father had painted it white the summer before I left for college. I remember him on his knees with a brush, methodical and quiet the way he did everything. My father was a quiet man, a good man, the kind of man who showed up without being asked and left without being thanked. And I don't think I ever once told him I understood that about him, until it was too late to tell him anything. The blue porch looked nice, it did, but I stood there thinking about the white one, thinking about my father on his knees, thinking about a presentation I gave in February of 1987 that I cannot remember a single detail of. My wife, Ruth, used to say I kept too much inside. We were married for 54 years. She died in 2014. And Ruth understood people in a way that I never fully did. She could walk into a room and know immediately who was hurting and who was pretending not to be. She used to look at me sometimes in a particular way, like she was trying to read something that had been written in a language she almost but didn't quite speak. She knew about Daniel. She knew about the phone call, about the presentation, about the distance that settled in afterward. And she never judged me for it, but she also never let me pretend it wasn't there. When I would say, "Danny and I are fine, we just don't talk much," she would look at me with that look, not angry, not disappointed exactly, just seeing me clearly, which was sometimes worse than anger. She said once, very quietly, "Walter, you know you can just call him." And I said, "I know." And then I didn't. For another 11 years, I didn't. I've spent a lot of time in these years since Ruth passed, sitting with the question of why. Not why she died. That kind of why leads nowhere. But why I waited, why I always waited, with Daniel, with my father, with Ruth herself sometimes when there were things I felt and didn't say, because the moment never felt quite right, because I was tired, because tomorrow existed, because I was always so certain there would be another chance. I was a man who believed deeply in the future. I thought that was a strength. I thought forward thinking was the same thing as hope. But somewhere along the way, I understood that I was using the future as a place to put things I was afraid to carry in the present. The apologies, the questions, the honest conversations, the phone calls I should have made years before I made them, or never made at all. The future was where I stored everything I wasn't ready to face yet, and the future kept accepting it until it didn't. There's a particular afternoon I come back to. I think it was 1991, maybe 1992. Daniel was visiting. We hadn't seen each other in over a year. He came with his wife, Patricia, and their 2 kids. We had a big dinner. My kids were still home then. The table was loud and full, and for a few hours it felt almost normal, the way it used to feel. After dinner, the kids went outside, and Patricia and Ruth were in the kitchen, and Daniel and I sat in the living room with our drinks, and the television was on with the sound low, and we just sat there. And there was a moment, I felt it, like a door opening slightly, a shift in the room. Something in the quality of the silence changed, and I knew that this was a moment when I could have said something. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I should have come that night. I've thought about it every day since. I'm sorry, Danny. I'm your brother, and I should have been there. The door was open, and I watched it close. I said something about the baseball season. He said something back, and we sat there together talking about baseball for another 40 minutes, and then it was time for them to leave, and I shook his hand at the door, and that was that. I've never forgiven myself for that afternoon, not because I said the wrong thing, but because I said nothing real when the possibility of something real was right there, briefly, and I chose comfort over it. There's something I want to say about phone calls. We talk about them like they're small things. You call, you don't call. But I've come to think there's something else. They're the smallest possible gesture that still requires courage. You have to decide to reach. You have to be willing to not know how the other person will receive you. You have to accept for the 30 seconds it takes to dial that you might be too late, or that you might say it wrong, or that the conversation might not go the way you imagined. And most of the time, for me, I decided that risk wasn't worth taking, that I would wait until I felt more ready, more certain, until the timing was better. I'm a 90-year-old man, and I'm here to tell you that I never once felt ready. Not once. Every important conversation I eventually had, I had before I felt ready. And every one I didn't have because I was waiting to feel ready. The readiness never comes. It just doesn't.
My son James came to visit last month. He's 62 now. He has his mother's eyes. The way he sits in a chair is exactly the way Ruth used to sit. Back straight, hands in his lap, that particular quality of stillness that always made me feel slightly untidy by comparison. We sat out on the back porch. It was a warm evening for this time of year. He was telling me about his work, about his daughter's new apartment in Boston, and at some point he stopped talking and we just sat there. And I thought about Daniel. I thought about 1991, about the door that opened and closed. And I said, James, is there anything you've ever wanted to ask me or say to me? Anything you've been holding on to? He looked at me, surprised. My family is we're not people who ask questions like that, typically. That's part of what I'm saying. That silence runs in us, was passed down like furniture. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Yeah, Dad, actually, yeah. and we talked for 3 hours on that back porch. We talked about things we'd never talked about Ruth, about a year when James was 15 and I was working too much and he needed me in a way I didn't recognize at the time, about a fight we had when he was 27 that I barely remembered, but that he'd carried for decades, about how much he missed his Uncle Daniel and how he always wished the two of us had been closer. We talked until it was dark and the bugs were loud and neither of us wanted to stop. When he left, he hugged me for a long time, longer than usual, the way you hug someone when you've said something real to them and it changed the shape of things between you. On the drive home, he called me from his car. He never does that. He said, "I love you, Dad. That was really good." I held the phone for a long time after we hung up. I thought, this is what it could have been, with Daniel, with my father. This is what was possible all those years. This is what I was always one phone call away from. I'm not telling you this because I want you to feel sorry for me. I don't particularly. I'm 90. I've had a life. I had Ruth for 54 years. I have children and grandchildren who are good people. I had a brother who said my name with kindness when he had every reason not to. I'm telling you this because of the camera on the dresser, because my granddaughter said, "Just talk," because I've been sitting across from this thing for 3 weeks, and what I keep coming back to, what I seem to need to say, is this. The silence after that phone call in 1987 never really ended. It went quiet for stretches. There were years when Daniel and I were warmer, when it seemed like maybe we'd finally moved past it. But it was always there, underneath the Christmas calls, underneath the handshakes at the door, underneath the baseball conversation in 1991 when I had 3 seconds to say something real and didn't. It was always there. It became part of the relationship. It became, in some ways, the relationship. And you can live with that kind of silence. I did. Most people do. You get used to it. You stop hearing it after a while the way you stop hearing a sound that's always present. But that doesn't mean it isn't there. It doesn't mean it isn't taking up space. It doesn't mean it isn't quietly, slowly, the whole time, costing you something. I have a photograph of Daniel on my nightstand. It's from the backyard, 1974. He's holding the football badly and laughing, and I must be just outside the frame because you can see him looking at me, laughing at something I said. His whole face is in it, that unself-conscious, completely open laugh. I look at that photograph every night before I sleep, and I think, we were right there in that backyard. We had all that time ahead of us, and we didn't know it was time, and we certainly didn't know it was running out. We were just 2 brothers in the backyard, and one of us was throwing the football badly, and we were both laughing. That's the thing about the moments you don't know are precious while they're happening. They don't announce themselves. They don't feel significant. They just feel like an ordinary afternoon. And then 40 years later, you're looking at a photograph and you understand the ordinary afternoon was the whole thing. That was it. That's what you had. The camera is going to stop recording soon. Battery's almost out. My granddaughter didn't leave me the charger. That feels about right, honestly. I don't have a way to end this that ties anything together. I've never been good at endings. Daniel would tell you that. Ruth would tell you that. I'm a man who has a tendency to let things trail off, to leave the last word unsaid. Maybe that's part of what this whole thing has been about. I'm 90 years old. My name is Walter Ashby. I had a brother named Daniel. I missed a phone call that I could have answered differently, and the silence that came after it lasted longer than I ever imagined silence could last. That's all I know how to say about it. If any part of this stayed with you, if there's someone you've been meaning to call, I don't know. I'm not telling you what to do.
I'm just an old man with a camera on his dresser, but I'll say this, the door doesn't stay open forever. That's all.